This podcast is a quest for well-being, a quest for a meaningful life through the exploration of fundamental truth. Enlightening ideas, insights on physical, mental, and spiritual health. The inspiration is love. The aspiration is to awaken new ways of thinking that can lead us to a new way of being well. Welcome to Body, Mind, and Soul Healing Conversations.
Are you afraid of loneliness or failure, confrontation or facing the unknown? Psychologist Dr. Nancy Stella draws on decades of experience in clinical practice in her new book, Fear Traps: Escape the Triggers That Keep You Stuck, which presents her concept of the courageous brain process, a 6-step, science-based treatment plan to help people overcome fear. Fear Traps equips readers to heal trauma and take on new challenges with confidence and resilience. Dr. Stella shows us that fear is normal, but fear does not need to control you. If you're feeling trapped in a cycle of coping mechanisms that just keep making things worse, there is a way out. With over 30 years of experience as a clinical psychologist, Nancy Stella, PsyD, PhD, helps us get unstuck by teaching us how our brain processes fear. Using current neuroscience research, her courageous brain process, CBP, provides transformative, science-based practices to regain control over the emotions that once controlled us. Valeria Teles interviews Dr. Nancy Stella, the author of Fear Traps: Escape the Triggers That Keep You Stuck. Dr. Nancy Stella has been a leading clinical psychologist in the Cincinnati area for over 20 years. As former president and owner, Dr. Stella expanded Bridgepoint Psychological and Counseling Center into one of Ohio's largest private, multi-specialty mental health practices with over 75 providers. After a shattering divorce, Dr. Stella found traditional therapeutic approaches wanting, so she developed the Courageous Brain Process, CBP, an innovative, science-based method of therapy. Rooted in the most up-to-date neuroscience, it bypassed the shortcomings of traditional talk therapy to repattern the way our brains process fear. When the results proved to be undeniably effective, Dr. Stella left Bridgepoint in 2014 to open a counseling practice focused on the CBP. As a result, countless clients have been able to break free of self-destructive patterns triggered by unresolved fear. In addition, Dr. Stella provides training and consultation to other clinicians who want to include this method in their practices. Meet Dr. Nancy at nancystella.com. Here is the interview with Dr. Nancy Stella.
In your own words, who is Dr. Nancy Stella?
Okay, first off, Valeria, I want to say thank you for having me on today. I appreciate it. Oh, that's a tough question in the sense that I have to think about how to answer that. I am, professionally, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have been in practice for over 30 years. Personally, I am the mother of 2 adult daughters who I adore, and 3 dogs. And I love to travel, particularly in the States. I enjoy, particularly Maine, particularly in the fall and in the colder months when the ocean is just brutal. It's beautiful to watch.
Oh, wow. That is an interesting.
Yes.
So interesting when you say about the ocean. Yeah, you like the
the ocean when it's not calm. I love clear water and clear, kind of calm everything. So it's interesting that you say quite the opposite. I'm wondering why. Why, Nancy?
Well, it's the power of nature.
Yeah.
And to me, it's phenomenal. It's beautiful. I feel like it puts human beings in perspective. Where is our place in this universe? And that, we're part of a whole.
My second official question is about fear. The idea that I have heard before, I have read and talked to some of my guests here, that fear is the opposite of love. What do you think about that?
Ooh. I don't think of fear as the opposite of love. I look at fear as being a kind of primal, protective instinct. It's part of how our amygdala, our brain is formed. And I think there's healthy fear. Healthy fear would be if you're in danger, you want to get to safety. If you walked off a curb and a bus was coming at you, you'd want to certainly get the heck out of the way.
Yeah.
But then there's unhealthy fears. Right.
Yeah.
And I think the unhealthy fears, particularly as it relates to my book, have to do with relationships. And I don't want to say it's the opposite of love, but it takes away from love. Because the focus gets put on our own issues, our own needs, and we forget about kind of the person we're interacting with.
So true. Oh, wow. So fear is the absence of love. Would you say that in a way?
I would say yes. It's the desire. Typically, it's the desire to be loved and accepted that can trigger our fear if it hits on old wounds or past traumas that we have.
Wow, I can relate to that. Thinking about all the traumas I had and how they manifested in my life later on for so many years. That's interesting how I couldn't see that. And I wonder why it takes so long, because it's obvious to me when I'm triggered. It's so obvious, but it hasn't been for so many years. What does it take for us to begin to recognize those triggers, Nancy?
Well, recognizing our triggers is not necessarily an easy thing to do, because oftentimes when we're triggered, it's bringing back old wounds. And so the way that I usually work with my clients and say, you're going to know if you're triggered by, one, if your reaction's out of proportion to the event. So you feel yourself emotionally or behaviorally reacting kind of out of proportion. The other is your thinking changes. It may become all black and white. There's no shades of gray. There's a variety of different ways that we could be triggered. And I have a list actually on my website that clients or your listeners can download. The important thing is that when we're triggered, we're able to take a step back and begin the process of trying to understand, what are we really reacting to here? What are we acting out? So, a fear trap is when we get stuck, when we are chronically fearful that something bad is going to happen based on something that has happened in our past. So, for example, I'll give you a personal example, and how it kind of led me to this concept is my husband of 22 years one day said he no longer loved me and wanted a divorce. And when I heard those words, it just put me into a tailspin. I felt like I was like on a free fall of fear. I was, and still am, a competent, and I was self-sufficient and successful. But I started to become kind of needy, clingy, crying, asking him to come back. And I knew those behaviors would not win him back. And what I realized is I was reliving a past trauma. My father had died shortly before I was 5. And when he died, our family just went into chaos. And so I had this fear. I reverted back to feeling like a 5-year-old. And that's also how we know we're triggered. When we revert back to an age that feels younger than we are. And the problem is when we revert back to those ages, I may not have acted like a 5-year-old, except for the crying and clinging and neediness, but we problem solve then from that developmental perspective. So if we don't resolve our fears, we're going to problem solve at an earlier age that may have worked then, but it doesn't work for adults.
That makes so much sense. I love to hear that. I actually didn't hear that before here. Surprisingly, that we do sometimes act like children. I mean, like very immature and insecure, and that it doesn't really match the way we kind of operate most of our lives. And I see that sometimes with myself even. But now it's so much better. It has gotten so much better with the relationship with my husband. Does it ever go away, really, Nancy, those triggers?
Not, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. On the one hand, I'm going to say, not really.
Yeah.
We have some pretty significant core wounds, things that have affected us in the past. We can learn to heal those wounds, but they are susceptible to being kind of scratched open again. The good news is, and how we can help minimize that, is by kind of recognizing what is happening, and there's certain strategies that people can do. Part of the problem is that when a trauma occurs, whether it be a major trauma or like a smaller trauma, like hurts, our brain forms pathways. So it could form a pathway in a big way, like a truck just barreling through a meadow and leaving its ruts, or it can form a pathway much slower, like little drips. So let's say you're in a meadow and you want to get to point A to point B. You walk that path. The first time you walk it, you're not even going to be able to see where your footprints are, but the more that you do it, the more the grass lies down. And that's like just a slow drip. And our brain, our neural pathways, our communication centers in our brain are much the same way. They form these pathways which trigger us to react in ways that are familiar to us. The positive news is we can develop new pathways. And the more that we develop new pathways and practice some of the strategies that I discuss, the more those old wounds and those old ways of behaving begin to change.
That's really good news, that we can actually rewrite the way we behave. Yeah, I love that idea. And it has been true in my case. But I still see the old patterns. They're still there. They don't go away, really. But I became much better at recognizing those patterns.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I say what I often tell my clients is if you feel that reaction, and it does feel like it's out of proportion, or you're reacting in an immature way, it follows the duct tape rule. If, imagine that you have duct tape, you put it over your mouth, keep it there for 24 hours. And if you still feel a need to react that intensely, then do it. If not, either learn to let it go or approach it in a healthier way.
What do you feel is the purpose of the human experience?
Boy, you can ask some tough questions. As you had said earlier, I believe that we are all connected. And, that part of our role is to recognize that we have a healthy, or strive to have a healthy interdependence with each other and with our world and our living beings. For me to try to say what I think the purpose is, to be honest, that is beyond me. What I know is what I feel like my role is, and that is to try to connect with those around me.
Yeah, I love that. That sounds very much like, if there's one purpose, one only, that'll be it. Uncovering, right, this truth that we are already connected. What is spirituality to you? And do you have any spiritual practices or belief systems?
Yes. I grew up as a Roman Catholic. I converted to Judaism as an adult, and I read quite a bit about Buddhism. So what my actual religious practice is somewhat of a conglomerate. In terms of spiritual practice, I am a strong believer in kind of mindfulness meditation, doing the kindness meditations, to put out kindness into the world. And to me, that's how I can practice spirituality.
Is that possible to live without entertaining any form of mental negativity? Can we stop those patterns, recognize them, and manage to stop them pretty much all the time? Is that possible?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible. I think we can certainly learn how to control them and minimize them. Research has found that when we worry, when we obsess, when we have negativity, our pleasure centers in our brain, our dopamine receptors are actually activated. Now, it doesn't mean that it feels good to worry, but that's what makes it so hard to shift away from kind of that obsessive rumination, the worry, the stressful thinking. And our, amygdala, our very primitive kind of anxiety brain, is also designed to be aware of what the smart brain, the frontal lobes, kind of worry about. So it takes a lot of effort and energy to practice moving away from negativity. Now, I can say after following that in my practice for years, I have greatly reduced negative thoughts, greatly reduced the kind of distress. I've gone through 2 bouts of cancer since I developed this model, and when I first got cancer, my first response was, why me? And then all of a sudden, about 10 minutes later, it dawned on me, well, why not me? I'm not special. I'm not unique. There's, millions of people get cancer all the time. And so it took away, not that I would want cancer again. If it was a gift, I would return it. But yet, in following my practice and what's written in my book, I am able to reduce my fear and those distressing negative thoughts. And when they pop up now, I can recognize it right away. And you nip it in the bud.
Yes, I love that. It sounds wonderful. There's to be open, the idea of being open to do the work, the healing work, as I call it. So thank you for not just talking about healing, but being the message. You're not just delivering a message, you are the message. You are living the message. Thank you, Nancy. Let me ask you this one. This is a fun one from my perspective. What do you love most about being in a human body?
Oh, good question. My first instinct is to say chocolate,
Yes.
that I could taste chocolate. I love that I can experience the world. I can experience nature. I can experience the feel of the sun, the wind, human touch, connections. I can smile. I can see others smile. I love that it's a way of being able to interact and connect.
My last warm-up question is about true power. How do you define what true power is?
Power is when we recognize the impact that we have and not to abuse it. So I think when we have power and we can settle ourselves and we know where we're coming from, we know the masks that we wear is not to use our knowledge about someone else against them.
That sounds like a form of control, manipulation, that doesn't sound good. That's interesting how you make me think about these things, because I try not to try, but it's the work we do to be somebody who's very transparent, very clear, and always kind, bring kindness to my environment, my family, and everyone that I am in touch with. But that's, like I mentioned off record, it's very subtle, the way we operate. And sometimes it seems like we have to always go deeper. And the deepest that I have gone, where the picture that I can see now, the big picture, is that everything's unconditional love. Life, what we call life, is unconditional love, which means everything is included. Even if we do things that are not right, not morally right, or whatever it is, it's still love. Being a human body is already fulfillment. It's a miracle. So you wrote the book, Fear Traps, Escape the Triggers That Keep You Stuck. Talk to me about how you became a writer and also the main inspiration and intention of writing your book, Nancy.
Okay. Let me begin with the main intention. I developed this model. I'm starting at the end, but I developed this model based on experiences of my own. And as I had mentioned earlier, my divorce, when I found myself kind of just stuck in this loop of fear. And I practiced this model not only for myself, but began working with my clients. And what I found was that most of my clients were getting stuck. They would go round and around in kind of these self-defeating patterns. And really did not know how to break them. After doing traditional therapy for about 20 years, I found that people could feel better, but it didn't seem to make a lasting change. And so my goal was, how do we help people make a lasting change? I was able to do it for myself after some traumatic events, and I began working with my clients. And for me then, that made me want to spread the message that we can heal, that there are ways to heal, and that as long as we accept what our vulnerabilities are, and we face those, and we realize once we face them that we can handle them, the world opens up. It opens up for us.
So true. I love this idea of being vulnerable, which has to do with not trying to control everything, right, Nancy? Our own emotions and everything that's happening now.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's learning to recognize what we can control and what we can't control. And there's a lot we can't control. So, giving it up.
Yes, I actually don't believe in any control, having any form of control.
I know, but we have the illusion that we do.
Yes, we do. That might be the most, let's say, the most deceiving kind of illusions, because it really feels real, like fear. It's so real that we have this impression, this conviction that we are in control. So speaking of the method, let's talk a bit about that. It's the courageous brain process. So it's a 6-step plan to help people overcome the roots of fear. And then you have the 6 steps. Would you like to go through the 6 steps, Nancy, or mention just some of them, perhaps?
What I'll do is I can just go through them briefly.
Please.
It's because each step is, a portion of each step is somewhat customized to what it is that you're struggling with. And in the book, I cover the 6 most common fears. But the first one is to tell your story. When I have a client come in, I want them to tell their story. And sometimes they say, well, I really can't remember some of these details, but this is what I think it is. And I'll tell them, if that's what you think it is, that's your story. So just go with it. It's your truth. So I want to hear their truth. And then as they tell their stories, I look for threads that are common themes that connects their, traumas or their hurts in their life. And then we begin to identify triggers. And again, triggers are identified anytime we're having kind of behaviors that aren't working for us, and we find ourselves getting into, a pattern of self-sabotage. And then we work through that, and then we get to the worst case scenario. And people typically, when they can look at what is the worst case scenario, can I allow myself to feel vulnerable to that? And it's surprising. Most people have a courageous brain. There's courage in there. We are resilient human beings. They may not like the worst case scenario or want to experience that, but when they realize that they will survive and they can deal with it, well, I then go through kind of a series of different mindfulness meditations with them and different practices to begin facing what their fear trap is. The other important thing to recognize is that we tend to believe what we think and feel. And our brain doesn't always tell us the truth, but we tend to believe it. And so it's learning to kind of challenge, is my perception of this, is my interpretation correct?
Oh, that's crucial, questioning our own selves. Yeah, I love that practice. I call it self-inquiry. I do that
that's
a
good.
lot.
That's a great word.
Yeah, always asking questions, why, in a very loving way, kind way.
Yes.
You have the 6 fears there, the most fearful things. And then I noticed that you don't have the fear of death.
Yes, people are afraid of death. And part of facing the fear of death is the acceptance that this will happen. And whatever your belief is, if there is an afterlife or if there is an afterlife, it's the inevitable. And how do we just accept it? And I'm going to go back to, again, having cancer, and especially the second time around, having to face my own mortality. And I could sit here and worry, how much time do I have left? Or I can engage with my world and enjoy it and feel as part of the one. But you're right. I did not address that in the book. And part of it is because it is it's a complicated fear. And it's one we just can't necessarily work our way through like the other fears that I mentioned.
So the idea of acceptance, I love that. Yeah, this is really close to my heart. Not just the intellectual understanding of acceptance, but going deeper than that. It's realizing that being here is a miracle already to be here. So even if we just took one breath and left, it was already fulfillment. It was already a gift.
Right.
So, wow. Yeah, that's for some reason my focus. I'm not sure why. Is fear the reason behind anxiety, depression, Nancy? It's always the case?
I look at fear as being the primary cause of our stress in life and our anxiety. Now, there's certain cases where people have truly a physiological, biological kind of predisposition to depression and anxiety. However, what triggers it is often fear.
The trigger, right.
Yes.
Right. Oh, interesting.
Yes.
And why did you become a clinical psychologist?
A good question. One is because I love people. I have this insatiable curiosity about people. And when I found out I had a knack for it, I was able to combine my interests with a profession. I actually have 2 doctorates. In my first one, I did research for about 6 to 7 years, and I just found out this is not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I needed to have, for me, something that was more meaningful. And that's when I decided to go into clinical psychology.
Yeah, so it has to do with meaning, right?
Yes, it's meaning.
I hear a lot the idea of purpose, passion, purpose. Is that something that you call it purpose too, that you have found your purpose?
Absolutely. It's purposeful to me. For me to be able to see someone heal, it's somewhat selfish because it truly is a gift to me. I feel like I am humbled to be kind of in that presence when people are telling me their stories and I see them heal and grow.
So I love the mindful, you have focused meditation exercise throughout the book. I love that. And I love how you have the different time frames too. The 3-minute one, 6-minute, 9-minute. That's a great idea. And another question I have for you is about one that caught my attention among the fears that you mentioned in the book. It was the last one, the fear trap 6. Are you afraid of the unknown? So talk to me for a moment about that, because most of us are afraid of the unknown.
We're afraid of what is not familiar. And so people often limit themselves because they're afraid to venture out of what's familiar in their comfort zone. And particularly if you struggle with anxiety, people with anxiety want predictability. So they want to know what's going to happen. And if they have to approach something that's unfamiliar, that's a trigger to them because it's scary, because it gets back to that issue of control. I don't know what I'm walking into, and I don't know if I will have control in this situation.
So another thing that caught my attention was that you say, somewhere there, you say, our culture reinforces the idea that material security will make us feel happier and more fulfilled when it truly does not. So talk to me for a moment about that statement.
Yeah. Well, I think in our culture, particularly a capitalistic society, which most of us grew up in, the idea is to keep gaining stuff, money, wealth, objects, new clothes, whatever it may be. And the problem is when we gain something that's a material item, the satisfaction from that, for the most part, is just a little, only lasts a little bit. And then the person's on the quest then to get more, so they want that continual high of achieving. But that doesn't bring us happiness. Stuff does not bring us happiness. Now, we know that people need a certain level of income so that there's things that they don't have to worry about for their basic human needs. But beyond that, it really is just stuff.
True, 1 billion times to that. Yes. And from your perspective, what brings true happiness?
I'm going to go back to the concept of connection. For me, what brings true happiness is when I feel connected to others. I think that brings us happiness. I think we can find happiness, for people who are parents, they may see their children happy, and that can bring them happiness. But for the long-lasting sense of well-being, it's that human connection.
Yes. Which, to me, there's a topic that I often write about and discuss here is self-love, unconditional self-love, and the interdependency, which is trusting oneself. Do you believe that it starts there? To connect with others, we need to first connect with ourselves?
Oh, absolutely. I think we need to know ourselves, know the masks that we wear, and not be afraid to allow ourselves to, I'm going to go back to this concept of being vulnerable, because when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, particularly in relationships, what we end up recognizing is that our strength actually comes from facing that fear of being vulnerable. Because if we can face our vulnerability, we can handle anything.
So true. There is so much power behind vulnerability. It's sad that most of us don't see that.
No, most of us try to avoid it.
Right. And how do we learn to pass the message, communicate this message with people around us? It has been a challenge for me to communicate the message of vulnerability.
It is a tough one because in our culture, vulnerability is thought of as something that you want to avoid. We want to avoid. We often equate vulnerability with a weakness. And so when people hear that word vulnerability, it's hard for them to think about how can our strength actually come from facing our vulnerabilities. That doesn't, that just sounds unpleasant, and how could that be true? And that's a message that's hard to get people to accept. Once they accept it and they start living it, is when they start realizing, okay, this feeds my strength. One way that I often help clients try to recognize vulnerability is by becoming more humble. And I don't mean, that they debase themselves or shame themselves, but becoming humble. And when they're humble, they can better than connect with other people because they can see other people with their strengths and their weaknesses and their imperfections just like themselves. And that helps them to begin to connect and not be as afraid of being vulnerable.
Yeah, so it has to do with trust.
Yes, it really is. It's leaning in. It's trusting. It's trusting.
I love this idea that we can practice that, experience that inner trust, and know that it's not just the body that's resilient, the mind. I mean, everything about us is so powerful, human beings. Yeah, it amazes me how resilient we are. Overall, yes. How amazing we are. What was the hardest lesson to learn about yourself and life as of today?
How to temper my own fear traps. I mean, really, how, let me take a step back. I like to think about this, but off the top of my head, what I would probably say is accepting responsibility for where I have failed others. That was probably one of the hardest lessons. And that really hit home to me, after my divorce or during the divorce process. Where's my responsibility in this? And again, not just for the divorce itself, but my responsibility, my place in the world. And, I had been so self-focused during the process that, I forgot about those around me.
I have heard something interesting before that you probably have too. It says, hurt people hurt people. It's kind of funny statement, but it's true, isn't it? When we are hurt, it's easy to hurt others.
It is. And, all that does is we end up in a, round and round and just going down the rabbit hole. And when we're afraid, our reaction is often to want to lash out, to hurt.
Right. Which has to do with fear. Yeah, pain, fear, all connected. So true. So let me see. I have too many questions here. I'll ask you this one. What is another word for healing? What comes to mind?
Growing.
Yeah. And my last question is, what are 3 things you wish everyone to experience or to have before they lose the body, before they die?
One is love. And it doesn't necessarily mean romantic love, but love and connection. To me, that is the most important. And hopefully from that, they experience a sense of being an important and valuable person, an important and valuable part of this world. And then third, I would hope that they would be able to kind of spread that love.
Experiencing what love is, connection is, and then sharing the good news.
And then sharing it, yes.
Yeah, how beautiful. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Oh, you're welcome.
For what you do, how you do it, and for being you. It's just beautiful. Thank you again. And before we say goodbye, where can we find more information about you, your books, products, services, and future projects?
Okay. I have a website. It's nancystella.com. And the book is available, Fear Traps, on Amazon. And right now we're working with some other distributors, so hopefully it will be at other sites. I am planning a webinar, which will likely be about 2 hours, that will happen most likely in the spring, where I will work with a limited audience on the ideas discussed in the book.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll have the link of your website on your podcast profile too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now, Nancy.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about Dr. Nancy Stella and her work, please visit nancystella.com.
To learn more about this podcast, please visit fitforjoy.org/podcast. Thank you again for listening, and bye for now.